Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube storytelling channel. I'm so happy to have you here. Today is Sunday. It's about 33 degrees here on the East Coast. Although the numbers are low, the sun is warm. I hope that you have been enjoying the story Nkauj Plig. I am here to read part 6 for you. Pull up a chair, relax, and enjoy. The sky began thundering when KheejXub rode out with his bow and arrow in hand. His heart was pounding with hate as he stopped halfway to the forest entrance and noticed that the gate had caught a red fabric on the nail that had been extended. He got off his horse and heard the arrow through the wind. He removed his sword and swung, cutting it in half as it fell to the ground in two. He turned and saw a figure dashing through the hills behind him with a red cloak. He began chasing and jumped across the hill to land in front of the man running with a broken, horrified look on his face. The man was shaking as he dropped his bow and arrow on the ground, where he fell to his knees. Taka, he cried as his head touched the ground. KheejXub kicked him over and placed his sword on the man's neck. The rain began to wash the dirt from his face as he breathed deeply. He asked. The man took a few gulps and then he whispered, Taka, KheejXub aimed the point of the sword into his flesh, and blood began coming out of his wound. He cried out, Taka, KheejXub's hands stilled and his eyes opened wide at the mention of his bride-to-be's younger sister. KheejXub cried out and slashed him across the shoulder. As the man got up and ran off, KheejXub couldn't get over what he had heard. He knew the woman had different mothers, but to hate someone who shared half your blood to see them die, that was brutal. And he would keep this part a secret until he figured out what was going on behind scenes. He got on his horse and rode back to his castle in the rain. When he arrived, the walls were cold and he was drenched. He went up the stairs and into his chamber where she was sleeping on his bed. A servant came in and he turned to her. Nupatauchi, he asked. Jitauchi. Mumbai kade sharaku. She left, and he removed his wet clothes and dressed in dry ones. The servant returned to put down the bowl of warm water and gathered his wet clothes, leaving him alone with her. He walked to her and put his hand on her forehead. She was developing a fever as he was afraid she would. He took the bowl of water and dipped the towel in. He began to wipe her face, her hands, and her neck, making sure not to touch her wound. Her lips began to shake, and he could hear her teeth chattering. No, she whispered. He reached for another blanket and put it around her, but she continued shaking, and he did what he knew would work best. He undressed, leaving only his pants on, and got under the covers with her. He pulled her into his arms and held her, using his body heat to warm her. Pavoa entered Jillian's bedchamber as she was getting ready for the night. The king would be joining her shortly as she removed the pins from her hair. She noticed that her daughter's handmaiden had a worried look on her face. She turned and stood up as the woman entered. Pavoa, Yamorachi, she asked. Nihotai, Nuna Mai Sia Mutua KheejXub Chitodology, Gutsa Sing Nuhain. Jillian's heart dropped. Oyana? Before she could address it further, Mumbai entered her chamber. Nihotai, Moidun Sai Saso, Totsana, Nusaso Sa Mai Sia. Jillian gasped and ran past them where she rushed down the stairs to find a young servant wearing a green cloak, the color of KheejXub's flag, standing in the hall. Nihotai, she said. Yoriga. Nihotai, Nuna Zai Hotai Mai Sia to Tua to KheejXub ta Jay, Morning John to Dom Mai Sia, that she no Nupu to KheejXub Jay Jung Chito no. Gusa saw to the name of the Neo Zipo. Nature said so. Kinh Su từ từ nửa rong lợ. Ta kỳ sơn gió, thọ nấy ta chua ta say. Chị tao, mà nó quỷ chị mù. Gu mi nè hoa tài. He Sing said as he walked into the hall. He came to take her hands. Mà nó từ lì lợ. Nhớ Mai Sia từ nhóm đó Kinh Su kể, cho nhiều xia. Ta kỳ lúc nụ trọ cả, cũng mà cho có một sai này như chị lì. Ủa lúc xia lọ. Then he turned to the servant girl. Ủa chờ có xa xá tô à? Một khai cho Kinh Su ưu niệu chỉ kể lù. Ủa lấy chỉ hoa tài. She laughed, and Jillian broke down and turned to fall into his arms. He touched her hair and pulled away to wipe her eyes. Sao qua? Cũng chân tìa giờ Kinh Su bá tu lời kể chính nhiều xia. Gió thế lì lọ yêu nữ bỏ nữ sẽ. Ủa lúc xia lọ. The pain shot through Mai Sia's shoulder as she found herself feeling heavy, and her eyes woke. She felt a warm body pressed against her, and she turned to find King Su's eyes wide open and watching her. It took a moment before she realized he was half naked and holding her in bed. When she tried to move, he tightened his hold on her, and she stopped. Something trả có lúc khoảng cái tròn thua. Cô cho lù, cô chỉ tao chân nhớ cho cô tu. Có one bởi mỏ. Cô bá tu có sư, he said. She felt her eyes water. Cơ đà. Ý thật sự nâng bà sáng bùi rấy tu bên niềm bầu lý nó. Giờ chỉ tao chả gì hết cơ đà sư. He smiled and reached out a finger to trace her jawline. Oli. Cô lúc kể yên cú cần gọi mỏ.แต่是cô知道错呀. Nhà cũng chơi nữa có. Yo chỉ yo có một bố cô thể lý sát tao. He got out of bed and pulled on her tunic. And then he came around and helped her to sit up. She groaned and he sat down on the edge of the bed. Cô xin cả đã chili. Yeah, Olika, she asked. He maintained a controlled look as he answered her. Cô tưởng trẻ thống của đại à. Chỉ bỏ lăng tư. Cô chẳng tìa tôi nâng nó nhưng nhiều trạc á lọ đùa. Giờ lì, xin hôn nào mù. Giờ có dùng một khó tư giờ chúng một cũng đó có. Cho cả tôi xí của con lùa. Chỉ bảo hay để tôi nâng phải nó giờ lăng tư. She thought a moment, and then she almost jumped when she realized something. Wow! Kunia! He touched her hand. Sao sao? Năm họ của tôi xa xó một đôi xíu hóa tại thế này hóa tại người ta là. Shalom giống mùa. Để rồi ít biển non gỡ tôi ở tôi sai cỏ. Hussein entered the castle walls of King Su's palace with his wife beside him. Bombay and Pavor trailed behind them as his servants welcomed them. He saw King Su walking down the stairs wearing a gold tunic and a green cloak behind him. The man was a strong one, without fear. He had been right in selecting him as the groom to his daughter. Chỉ hóa tài thế này hóa tài, trong xia này tôi cho của vào của trẻ. Tu xia chỉ hỏi tu xia hở luôn gì, King Su said as he reached them. Mai Sia nhớ đâu hả tư? Jillian asked. Zai gì? Cho này hóa tài mua trái Mai Sia. The servant that had welcomed them led Jillian up the stairs as King Su gestured for Hussein to sit with him at the table. Drinks and snacks were immediately brought in as the two men sat down. Cơn thiệp ở tàu lăng tư, nhà tù tô Mai Sia, Hussein asked. King Su looked up at him and took a drink of his wine. Chị tàu. Cô tôi xa nâng muốn thiệt thông của đại á ta. He gestured for his men-at-arms who brought out the arrow he'd taken out. Tôi nâng lô sĩ tàu nọ. Có bà tàu bỏ đùa. Hussein took the arrow and turned it around in his hands. He didn't recognize it. Chị tàu. Cũng gà. Mù trâu của chân nâng bán thiệt thiệt bổ cho tàu. Tàu cơ. Hussein handed it to Bombay, and he took a drink from his cup of wine. Một tay chỉ sinh nọ. Cô chỉ tàu tôi hay kể rừng xuyết đó có. Sao được khó có một tối dân tự dân chúa. Đó là sao và sao trẻ. Nếu nọ. Cô tôi sao là. Cô tôi ngã tệ hay kể rừng xuyết sớ có rõ. King Su smiled and took the cup of wine. Ôi trời đất ơi, chỉ hóa tài cho lưu rong. They shared a drink together and then looked up when Mai Sia came down the stairs with Jillian. Hussein stood and walked over slowly to see that his daughter had paled in facial color, and he gently reached out a hand to touch her hair. Mai Sia's eyes filled up with tears as she wiped them away. Lo. Có nếu tôi cho có một trẻ. King Su stood up and walked to them. Chỉ hóa tài. Julie của yêu ôn nâng chỉ bảo chạy. Để she Mai Sia lúc khoảng cái chỉ tao rong. Cứ xa mà, kia nữ nhỏ nón thật cô, còn được khoảng cái rong chỉ cho. Cô mà cho nữ tua. Dần gió thế li là, Mai Sia nhưng yêu cô bảo cô sẽ. Hussein took a deep breath. Giờ, nhưng giờ lý có hại thế. Giờ mùi tiền trẻ lúc hóng cái yếu tròn đùa. Dì, Mai Sia interrupted. Chị ôi chà, mù lo yên tao cơ. KheejXub stepped in and gently took her arm, leading her toward him. Chị tao. Gucci King. He put an arm around her and pulled her to his side. Dì hóa tài, thế này hóa tài. Cô cha lùi. Yếu sai Mai Sia có rong. Cô dân mua cho tu tên giải trí chống lần là bá tu. Nếu tu nếu gì. Sao nhiều xia. Cô lưu vào lưu trẻ. Khi giải tòn đấy cho lưu xí hở. Khó cô chỉ bố nữ muốn hôn nọ vì cũng trai trả nữ lúc hóng cái cho lòng trả. Hư sinh nodded. Cô sao ya lọ. Mình sai. Cô sao nhiều xia. Cô yên chân tàu tìa. Giờ mua tu. KheejXub là tu có lỡ. Cô tu chính bỏ rong. AiniSua kicked open the door to her mother's chamber and found her mother sitting with her hands over a bowl of hot water. Steam was rising as the room felt warm. She closed the door and anger fumed her. The assassin had failed in his mission to kill her sister, and now the man had disappeared from the village. She only hoped he would keep his mouth closed. Her father had gone to visit her sister earlier today, and she had been asked to go, but came up with an excuse of being sick. Nia, AiniSua said as she came to her mother. Kaluchi kumodago. Tu tsinen da, ni tu wachi tao ni sa halu hai che. O tia ka sai neng mo halu e, ka ye sai tao te ka neng, ka kai o lo li. Ye lu cheng zhao le zao gu ji hai tia gu ya tu ndia neng mu to mai sia che, gu ka to. Nkauj ignored her daughter's plea and looked up from the steams. Nin cai zhuo. Yo ya tao tư ka ma bao hai tia, cho ya gu o ya ba ka do sna. Yo ka zao ye kan zhe ya ka chi o ka. Ka lo nong gu wa da chi. Nia, gu hay ka bao, gu yo mun tia cheng tu. Nữ tí lăng thế lý tụi bá tao cũng sẽ hở nọ. Giờ có chẳng xa nhau luôn nâng ca xia thế kì. Cơ cả chỉ là lần chạy bá của sư mà. Nkauj stood up and walked to her, and then she slapped her across the face. Cả xa hai tía cả ô lý nào ổn đây, cả yếu tao lúc hư khỉ nó ló. Dạ cả ô nó, mới tao sẽ hở mềm mê đâu cả. Thì she cũng chẳng tao hai tía, tụi xin nâng tao lúc khánh châu yếu trình chiên đấy. Ổn đây cả yếu muốn thía cả tụi mi chênh tụ, cả chiêu muốn thía tụi xin nâng cả xa một cho, cả tụi nè lao cho xia. Trẻ nữ họ luôn tu nó, có thể một cái xia. Chỉ lý có ít tuổi, cái nữ ở tuổi gì có cơ tuổi. AiniSua grabbed a fistful of her hair and pulled. Tỷ có sức của nè. Chả có yếu gì, chả có chủ tiêu rong sai. Có nên trẻ tối tôi năng của tôi chỉ lần giải có, yêu tôi cố nên chỉ lần giải cuốn ta. Cú lo lý nó sư. Mua rong, và rong chế lúc mua rong câu là, họ cú lúc sáng bao mong cô lô ta cú. Cứ chào này hóa tăng bỏ nó đó. Chủ kia. Cứ cháu là hai lũ được cuốn gì là. Cú bảo cú cháu kỹ cháu. Chỉ tại có yếu là hành tàu hành tế. Có lũ họ pia, nhưng muốn thiệt cả tàu tụi xin năng đỡ sư. Yếu có ô chỉ tàu chế, sẽ có lúc lá này có bật giấc qua giấc trái chân khí dương mà. Mai Sia entered her chamber to find AiniSua sitting on the edge of the bed with the gold fabric in her hands. She found it odd that her sister would be inside her chamber, for this was a new scene for her. KheejXub had returned her back home, and she hadn't been in her chamber for a few days. But she closed the door and walked in, watching as AiniSua stood and extended her hands holding the fabric to her. Nilao, she said with a soft tone. Gu thao zi wa thao ka tao mo, gu tu shai shi tao ka. Che, ka tu shia la ba. Mai Sia kept her distance, and then she moved to the table where she kept her nightly rose water. She poured it into the basin and began to wash her hands. AiniSua's face broke into horror, and then she threw the fabric onto the ground. She stepped right over it and came to stand before Mai Sia without holding her anger or hiding her hate. Cái sao tiệt, vì có một cái cây là tổ lúc rõ nói, cái gì hay lý giải được của là tao tàn nó. Chó vợ hay tiệt, cái gì sợ là tôi cho nó chỉ sẽ tụ. Turning to face her, Mai Sia gave her a bleak glare. Thảo tư có sự gì nói hay tiệt, cũng như là真我tôi cho thảo của chỉ riêng ta nó. Có nó cũng cho lù nó có từ lo nè. Là giờ có luôn dâu giờ từ xuống một to sai vấn đề. In an instant, AiniSua rammed her fist into her injured wound and she fell over. She stood over Mai Sia's body and continued ramming her fist into her flesh. Blood began oozing out, staining her white dress as tears streamed down her face. Her strength wasn't her usual, and as she tried to use her hand to stop her, AiniSua pinned her down. Cái sai tiệt cũng chạy con nó bỏ. Có bỏ bao. Cứ có là tao tao xong bỏ tử. Chỉ nó nó mù. Có thiết cứ giờ yên dùa. Thầu con chán đó, cứ lúc số lùa. Yo giờ khó con nó. Thầu con mò xia. Cứ yếm bộ tệ. Có nhớ trong linh đó nó mà. Cứ tụi mi nè lào. The wound had reopened, and blood was oozing out as the stitches were torn. Mai Sia groaned deeply and gently peeled off the dress to look in the mirror. Whatever the doctor had done was destroyed, and it would now leave a scar. A tear escaped from her eyes, and with shaking hands, she tried to reach for the water to wash when she fell to the ground in pain. She was struggling when the chamber door opened, and Pavo walked in with KheejXub behind her. Her servant shouted and tried to come forward, but KheejXub pulled her away and came ahead. He gathered her into his arms and took one look at the wound. Look, he asked. Tia Gunda. He looked at the wound, and his eyes told her he didn't believe her. Pavo, Pavo nodded and left, closing the door behind her. He picked her up and laid her on the bed. When he tried to look at the wound, she stopped his hands from touching her. Their eyes met, and she gave him a warning look. He smiled and lowered his hands. She let his hands go, and he came to peek at the wound again. The door opened, and Pavo returned with the items he requested. He took them and set it aside. Pavo nodded and left. He took the rag and dipped it into the water. He began gently washing it and noticed that the stitches were ruined. This time, a scar would be left, no doubt about it. He finished cleansing it, applied the antibiotics needed, and bandaged the wound. He reached for a blanket and covered her before removing the bloody basin and rag to the table beside her. He washed his hands, and then he came to sit beside her. KheejXub said. She ignored his gaze. Laughing, he replied, Mai Sia shot her head toward him. He smiled and reached a finger to touch her jawline. She moved out of his touch. He leaned in closer to her. He got up to go when her voice stopped him. He turned back around and winked at her. Laughing, she rolled her eyes. He took a deep breath. He smiled. KheejXub found AiniSua walking down the hall from her chamber, and when she saw him, she turned around, but he caught up with her and blocked her path. She gave him an annoyed look, but he only smiled as he watched her movements of fear appear before him. She asked. He laughed. Oh, he watched as her eyes narrowed with questions. He smiled and began applauding her. Tia shi, ya tun chan da ya của bao của sẽ, tu nên tờ ya của tu yên chúa, của cho yên chúa, của yên chỉ thọ sẽ dùng gì, của mà lại tờ rử tua, còn nếu số qua cái uế trong cái khai đồ nên tế bảo hay tia, cái dân xía trong này cả. Sau có lúc số mà mình nè lo, Chả sợ con nữ kể có lũ số lũ, yếu chỉ rong hài. Nó, yếu lũ chén tổng đồ cọ vấn đề. He watched as her eyes began to fill with tears, and then she began shaking. He smiled at her and walked down the stairs as she stood remaining where she was. Thank you for tuning in to Zai Plig Part 6. Part 7 will be uploaded shortly.